Hello again, flute tubers. Yeah, sorry about calling you that. I'm here wearing my approximately 27-year-old Oberlin sweatshirt with my 27-year-old Oberlin mug because I want to talk to you more today about my experiences studying with Michel Debost at Oberlin, and specifically how he ran our weekly flute class. The reason I'm recording this today is that I had a talk this week with one of my freshmen who's doing great in the class, but she wanted to tell me that when we hold our weekly flute classes, which oddly this year are over Zoom, she feels a little bit awkward giving feedback to the older students, the seniors and the graduate students who are in our class. And so I told her this story to reassure her that giving feedback is at least equally as important for the person who's verbalizing it as it is for the person receiving the feedback. And it's also great for your peers to learn what you heard while you were listening to each other, because you develop more of a sounding board that way. You become more intelligent about how you listen to other flute players. So I wanted to tell all of my students this story by virtue of Flute Tube, so that they can think about what my flute class experience was like at Oberlin and be inspired to practice as much as possible in the same way that I did for my classes at Oberlin. I think that Michel Debost was incredibly intelligent about how he organized and ran our flute classes. I also think that he brought as much back with him as he possibly could, the way things had been done at the Paris Conservatory, where he taught for many years before he came to Oberlin. And in fact, when I got my current university teaching job, which I've had for 20 plus years, I wanted to run it as much like Michel Debost did as possible. But I realized that that wasn't very practical. We just don't have a lot of the resources that he had at the serious music conservatory of Oberlin. Even though my students are very serious and they win a lot of awards, still we don't have those resources. For instance, they only get half as many credit hours for their private flute lessons in their flute class as we got at Oberlin. And Oberlin also had a lot of monetary resources that we don't have. But just so my own students don't get discouraged about the great things that I had at Oberlin, it would be good for them to remember that their tuition is about 1/12 what the tuition is at Oberlin right now. And BYU, where I teach, was ranked #1 best value music school in the nation quite recently. So cheers. Now let's go on to talk about what our flute classes were like at Oberlin. They started out with all of us getting word about which pieces we were supposed to learn during the school year. Early in the summer, before we would go to Oberlin in the fall, we would all receive in the regular mail a letter from Michel Debost welcoming us to the studio, and it included a list of about 30 pieces that we were all supposed to get. We all got the same 30 pieces. There were also perhaps 3 or 4 etude books on that list and some excerpts, but those were the things that we needed to get and have in our hands before we arrived on campus at Oberlin to begin our flute studies with Michel Debost. And I should also mention that not all of our flute studies at Oberlin were with Debost. We had the opportunity to sign up to study weekly in an orchestral excerpts class with John Rottenberg, who was the associate principal flutist with the Cleveland Orchestra at the time. And we also all had monthly technique lessons with Kathleen Chastain. She was Michel Debost's wife and a fabulous flute player in her own right. And we could sign up for Baroque flute studies with Michael Lynn. So when I talk about studying with Michel Debost at Oberlin, that did not even comprise our complete flute studies at Oberlin. But back to my list of 30 pieces that we would receive in the mail. I do remember some of those pieces. I remember my freshman year quite clearly because it was a big deal at the time. And I can tell you some of the pieces we were required to get. That list included a large variety of things. He made a point to put many different kinds of repertoire on each year's list. So it included the Doppler Hungarian Fantasy, it included the Reinecke Concerto, Mozart G Major Concerto, Schubert Trachtney-Blumen Theme and Variations, Böhm Grand Polonaise, Casella Sicilian A Burlesque, Martinu Sonata, Ferud 3 pieces for flute, the Bizet-Born Carmen Fantasy, Nielsen Concerto, Messiaen Le Mer Noire. It included Hindemith Sonata, Martin Ballade, and something like 17 other pieces. And if you think through what happens in a school year, doing 30 pieces means that you do about one entire work every week. So I had one lesson on the entire Reinecke concerto. So you might be thinking, how is it possible to learn all of that music with one lesson? That's such a tiny, brief overview of the Reinecke concerto. And you would be right, but flute class is what provides the answer to that question. So let me describe to you now what would happen in those weekly flute studio classes at Oberlin. They were 3 hours long on Tuesday nights, so 6 to 9 p.m. And we did the same 30 pieces in those classes that we did in our private lessons. So that's how we came to learn each piece on a much deeper level than if we had only worked on them 1 week with Mr. Debost. There were 18 of us in his flute class, and each week 4 performed, and so that means we each played about 3 times per semester, and he assigned us specific weeks to play and specific pieces to play. So 6 to 8 p.m. every week, we would hear 4 people, a half hour each, and we had a studio pianist who would come in from Cleveland. He was a great flute repertoire player, and he would work with the students in these mini lessons / rehearsals with Michel Debost while we all listened. So most of us would be sitting there at desks in this little classroom setting with our own music that we all had, listening and just observing while Michel Debost worked with these 4 students for a half hour each. And then after 2 hours, we'd take a little break and we'd go down to the recital hall, and we'd have our final hour as a performance class in the recital hall. The same 4 people would perform, again with accompanist, but now they would do a straight run through like a recital performance. And after each performance, all the rest of us, the other 17 students, would give the performer comments. And I learned so much that way because I knew I had to have plenty of things to say, because we would go around the room pretty arbitrarily. We'd never start with the same place. You never knew whether you were commenting first or last. And you had to say something that had not yet been said. And then after all of the students gave their comments, Michel Debost would also comment. And in that way, I really learned a lot about verbalizing what I heard and listening more deeply. And also that means that for the Reinecke concerto, not only did I play it in one lesson with Michel Debost, but I heard about 3 or 4 different students work on it with him for a half hour each, plus play it in a recital setting. And that's actually a lot of time to spend with one complete concerto. Just as a small side note, sometimes I have students who don't like it when they learn that one of my other students is working on the same repertoire that they are working on. But think about Oberlin and think about how Michel Debost's entire strategy relied on us all playing the same pieces as each other. You learn a lot from hearing each other play repertoire, and also there just are certain pieces that we all must know inside out as flute players. For instance, that Mozart G major concerto that was on my list for my freshman year, of course I'd already done because I was a very serious flute player. Probably most everybody had done it, but we all had to do it again and study it with Debost and hear each other play it. And we were doing a lot of flute work that was new and very demanding. If you were going to do a recital or a competition or an audition or a music festival, anything like that, it was always on top of this basic baseline of work that we were all doing. And we also did lots of etudes, at least 2 or 3 a week. We did lots of technique work, including the scale game, which I talked about in a different episode and was one of the most important things I did at Oberlin, so I'll put a link to the scale game in here. And of course we did orchestral excerpts and other things like that. So even though I can't require my students to do the same sheer volume of work that we did at Oberlin, try to emulate it. Think about just how much we went through every semester. See how much different repertoire you can do. Be sure you're doing your etudes and you don't skimp on those, and all of your technique. And also be sure that you have patience for our weekly 2-hour flute classes. Remind yourself that they could be 3 hours. That's what I did, and those 3 hours were very beneficial. And also, if you're tempted to tell yourself, well, that was a music conservatory, here I am at a university, things are different for me. You can look at it that way, but you have to keep this in mind. Oberlin is both a full-fledged music conservatory and they have a separate, independent but cooperating college. So 1 in 5 conservatory students, including myself, applied to both the college and the conservatory, were admitted to both, and were doing separate degrees in both. So I was doing a Bachelor of Music in flute performance, and at the same time I was also doing a Bachelor of Arts in math. That was a lot of work. It was kind of insane. But my point is, I did that very serious conservatory music training, and at the same time I was a math major. It was crazy. But still, try to up your flute game. See how much you can accomplish every week. If I can do that craziness for the span of time that I was at Oberlin, you can do it too.